listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
Hey, what is going on? How you doing? And thank you for checking out my show, Straight to Video. On today's episode, I ask you all to humour me a little as I get to talk about what I consider the greatest horror movie franchise of all time, and once again go down a Nightmare on Elm Street rabbit hole. After having the likes of Jesus Garcia and Lisa Wilcox on the show in the past, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Freddy Krueger's mum to the show as I chat to actress Beatrice Boepple, who played Amanda Krueger in the fifth installment of the series The Dream Child. Beatrice also starred in Stakeout alongside Richard Dreyfuss and Emilio Estevez, and also in Deadly Pursuit with Tom Berenger, Kirstie Alley and the late Sidney Poitier. A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, which was released in 1989, much like its predecessor The Dream Master, is super special films to me as I got the chance to see them the summer of their release in the USA, right when I was fully obsessed with all things Freddy Krueger. As most would admit, he really is probably the most unique and odd pop culture icon in history, but for some reason this dream-killing demon became a hero of the MTV generation, and me, I was all on board and somehow managed to persuade my dad to take me to see this film. Part 5 is a film I've grown in appreciation for over the years. Whilst it was rush released, I think it's a great movie that gets better with age and certainly pushes a lot of boundaries compared to what a lot of horror films of the time were doing, with more adult and realistic themes such as teenage pregnancy, drinking and driving, and even eating disorders. Pretty heavy stuff at times. Now, I had a lot of fun chatting with Beatrice, who after this film walked away from the movie industry into different careers and raising a family, but since being introduced back into the franchise fold with the release of the 2010 documentary Never Sleep Again, she was brought into the convention world and saw how much importance these films had to thousands of fans to this day, and she is now incredibly active on social media and can be found meeting fans all across America, and will be visiting the UK later this year at Hampshire HorrorCon in Southampton. That takes place in early November, along with a host of other Elm Street and horror guests attending, which I am very much looking forward to. Before our chat, please show some love and support for our friends Dead Skull Coffee for their continued support of this show, and they're serving up 15% discount on their ground and full bean coffee. Simply place your order at deadskullcoffee.co.uk and add the discount code STV on checkout. I also want to send a shout out to the latest patron on the Straight to Video Patreon page, Anthony Winson. Thanks so much for your support, mate. It really means a lot. Anthony is a great horror filmmaker himself, so be sure to search out Mr. Stitch Films on Facebook and YouTube and see the brilliant Victorian horror movies he makes. If you would like to get more involved in this show, then our Patreon page offers you behind-the-scenes access, a bonus podcast and exclusive merch, all of which can be found over at patreon.com/STVpod. Alright, let's get into today's episode. Beatrice is super warm and friendly, and it's so great to see how she embraces this film, which is now over 30 years old. But I know the Elm Street fanbase are stoked to see her back in the spotlight. So for now, please enjoy my chat with Freddy Krueger's mum, Beatrice Boepple.
His mother was a God-fearing woman. His birth was an unspeakable horror.
Please don't let him do that!
His life and death have been one incredible nightmare. But now all that is going to change because Freddy wants to become a daddy.
Want to make babies?
What's wrong with me? You're just a little pregnant.
Even if he has to adopt.
No!
Do unborn babies dream?
When it comes to chills.
It happened while I was awake.
When it comes to screams.
The party just start.
When it comes to pure terror.
Bon appetit.
No one delivers like Freddy.
Better buckle up.
All right, Krueger. This time it's for keeps.
A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child.
It's a boy.
When it comes to terror, remember, Freddy knows best.
You've been on such a varied journey since very young, both in your personal and professional life. And I believe you spent some of your early childhood in Japan. What particular memories do you have of that experience? What led you there? How was it adapting to this totally different culture so young?
Well, the fact that I went as a youth, we moved to Japan when I was 5. So I hadn't even learned the alphabet yet. So Japanese ended up being my first written language. I was just put in a Japanese school, and it was in the 60s. So back in those days, there really were no foreigners. There was, some military folk, but, it just wasn't, filled with foreigners. My sister and I were the only two non 100% Japanese people in the school that we were put in, and we learned really, really quickly. So culturally, it was amazing. And I think so much of my aesthetic and how I prepare food, how I love the very Zen look, very clean and sparse and beautiful. So, however, one of my strongest memories was in my second grade class. And again, so you got a picture, it's all Japanese kids and me, who, because I have dark hair, for some reason I thought nobody would know any different. You know how kids are. I thought I fit right in. But our teacher was giving us, of course, in Japanese, giving us a lecture on the Hiroshima bombing, and it was horrifying to hear about it. And this was in the 60s, so it wasn't that far back in history for them. And she gave us this, grotesque accounting of all the horror that happened with nuclear bombing. And it was just awful. And we were all shocked and sad. And then at the end of her lecture, she looks at me and she points to me and she said, "It was those Americans." And I was in shock. My jaw dropped and the whole class turned and looked at me. And, it was awful. It was a mixture of having people either fawning over me because I was strange and different and exotic, or people really hating me because I was American, which when you're American, you got to get used to that.
Do you still have any connections with Japan? Have you ever been back?
I've gone back many times. As an adult, I brought my boys, and both my sons, they're both in college now, they both took Japanese in high school. Our high school offered it as a language, which was really wonderful. So they both speak Japanese and can read a bit. And so I took them with me, and we spent several summers actually staying at a place called Yamasa Institute, where we studied Japanese, and they got to live there in a little home and stayed with family. So I keep my connection with Japan.
Was Japan where you got your first taste of acting in front of an audience?
Yes, it was. I was in kindergarten, and they did a couple little plays, and I got to be in those plays. At the time, it was kindergarten, so I didn't speak Japanese yet. I was starting to learn by hearing, but I wasn't speaking yet. So they gave me these non-speaking roles. I think I played a tree, and I played a tiger or something like that. But it was my first appearance in front of an audience.
When did you move back? Was it Canada you moved back to?
After Japan, we actually moved back to the States for another 4 years. We lived on a farm, and then we lived in a strange commune. My parents took us to this commune that turned out to be this very freaky cult. And so they had to kidnap us back out of there. Another crazy story. Then we ended up moving up to Canada. So I was in Canada from grade 7 through high school, through college, actually.
Was it tough moving back to, let's say, Western civilization? Was it tough fitting back into school, or was kids interested in that you'd live somewhere so different?
When I first came back to the States, as I mentioned, I hadn't learned the alphabet, and I still hadn't learned the alphabet. So at age 9, I still couldn't read or write English. But Sesame Street really, and then this other show back in the 60s called The Electric Company, which was, kind of a progression of Sesame Street. Those two are really what taught me how to read and write. I definitely learned from watching that. And so I had to catch up really quick. And the culture in America was shocking to me when I came back. Just how casual everyone was, and how kids would just be sitting back in their chairs. People were very casual with a teacher. I was in shock because in Japan, no, you stood up straight, you bowed to the teacher, you kept your mouth shut. We were so obedient. So I was a little bit horrified by American culture.
Favorite Sesame Street character?
Oh, I love so many of them, but that little Elmo wasn't around when I was watching it. I loved Oscar the Grouch.
He was the coolest looking one, 100%. Were you a big fan of films as a child and a teenager? Coming back to America and Canada, was film kind of an escapism for you?
I would say as a kid, I didn't get to see that many. Certainly, for whatever reason, my parents, they're both really career-oriented and didn't get to see very many movies. I think the only movies we saw when I was in Japan, we saw Sound of Music. We saw 2001: The Space Odyssey, which the actor Keir Delay, the star, he actually had the same agent as my mom, because my mom did some acting when she was young. So we got to go to a screening with him to see that. But anyway, and then in the States, I think the only ones I remember seeing in the movie theaters with my parents anyway was Camelot, Jaws, and Star Wars. I got a lot more into film, once I was on my own, starting at 18, because my parents then left the country and basically they've never come back. So then I really got immersed in film, and especially as an actor, it was great because that's what we would do when we didn't have auditions. We'd just go to all these matinees and watch tons and tons of movies.
And you found a joint love of both acting and the equestrian horse world, I believe. What introduced you into your love of horses?
Well, when I was in Japan, I would watch this Yabusame, which was this amazing archery that often it was monks, but I think other people did it too. But they would ride on horseback and do archery. But the ones that I would see at these festivals were blindfolded, be galloping along and then, just do this aim. And they would always just get there. It just was so amazing to me, that and taiko drumming. Then when we moved back to the States, my mom wanted to have a farm. So we had sort of, I guess what you'd call a hobby farm. It was only half an acre. We had a pony, a whole bunch of goats, which became my sister's love. She's still a goat breeder in Canada. And we had pigs and we had chickens and ducks and geese and all kinds of stuff and tons of dogs and cats. So I just fell in love with that pony. He was mine. And, he taught me so much. My pony, he was this little old guy and he would throw me off every single possible way. He would run, and then stop. And I would, fall off because they couldn't afford a saddle. So I was riding bareback and then he'd run, and then stop and put his neck down. So I'd fall over the front, run, and then sit down. So I'd fall off the back or veer off and take me under a tree. So I'd bang my head, pull me by as close as he could to the fence to scrape my leg. I mean, he was just nasty and ornery. And I finally earned his respect because I just kept coming back on. And one day he just all right, you're my human or whatever. I don't know. And he just fell in love with me and vice versa. And we were inseparable after that. I would be in the house, in the kitchen, and the barn, was at the back of the property. And I would start to think about him. And the moment I'd think about him, he'd start to whinny. We were just so connected. Anyway, I was so in love with my pony, Jim, and I joined the 4-H horse club. Then when we moved to Canada, and then when I ended up in Vancouver as an actor on my own, I talked my agent into buying a racehorse with me, this beautiful horse named Trust Me Soda. And just always loved horses. But, it's an expensive hobby, so.
But wasn't you thinking of pursuing that as a career at one point? What kind of angle was you going into?
I mean, I wouldn't do veterinary because I can't do blood and all that. It's funny, as a horror actor, I can't do blood. But anyway, so I was thinking of, horse training, I guess, something to do with horses. And I applied to equestrian colleges as well as the theater school. And I couldn't afford the equestrian college.
Theatre came to be the decision. Did you have a particular vision? Did you want to go into the theatre route or pursue TV and film?
Well, already at the time, so in the 80s, so I finished college in 84. I graduated, it was the theater program at university. And Vancouver was already known as Hollywood North. Almost every TV show was filmed in Canada, Vancouver or Toronto, both coasts. And the nice thing about the acting community in Canada was, and probably still is, very, very open in terms of the flow for actors. You do stage, you do film, you do commercials, you do bit parts, you do leading roles. And there's just this nice fluidity. It's almost like the whole community, to a degree, is like being part of a theater troupe. You all take turns. One day you're the lead, one day you have the walk-on role, and there's no stigma with that.
Just constantly working at whatever level.
You want to work, and so there was, to train to be an actor, you had your classical training, you had 10,000 trillion hours of Shakespeare, learning Macbeth. I remember even writing a song about Macbeth, I Hate You to Death, just because we had to learn hundreds and hundreds of hours of, we just have to be able to just nonstop, and memorize the entire script, but just breaking it apart in every detail. I mean, it's a fantastic play. I mean, I love it. But I remember in college, I was like, enough, To be honest, our particular program really was only focused on the stage. They didn't do anything for film and TV. But film and TV was, to be honest with you, it was easier to get. There was just a lot more work. I mean, theater was wonderful, and I did both. Although, theater is a little more terrifying in some ways.
You only get one shot.
One of my worst memories was I had just finished doing Stakeout, or I was in the process of working on Stakeout with Emilio Estevez and Richard Dreyfuss. And I got cast in a play called, anyway, I can't think of the name, but it's actually a British writer. Anyway, but there was only 3 people in the play. And it was my first regional play, my first equity show. So with just a 3-hander, it's not a lot to fall back on. And in some of my scenes, it was just me and one other actor. And we were in this massive theater outside of Vancouver. And I was doing the show, and on one particular instance, during one of the acts, when the curtains went up, the curtain was caught under a piece of furniture. And so you heard this big rip, and it literally ripped and started to shower down this red velvet or fluff, from the curtain. We were already on stage, and I was working across this woman, and it was a very serious scene where she's, very stern, and she's yelling at me, and I'm, I'm this young teenage kid. And while we're doing the scene, a piece of that fluff had landed on her upper lip. And so, I'm trying to avoid it. I'm just focused and just, doing my scene, and she's looking at me and trying to stay fully in character. But every few breaths, she's like, blah, 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 blah. And she's like blowing at her lip and wiping at her lip. And she couldn't get the stupid thing off, you know, it was obviously really tickling her. And she just kept blowing and blowing. I had to laugh so badly, but I was trying to stay in character. And so I turned my head upstage so that people could only see my back. And I'm kind of shaking with laughter. But, you know, I was trying to make it look like I was crying, which would have worked for the scene. When I got off that stage, I just burst into laughter. And, you know, laughter sounds like it's fun. It's horrible. It's horrible when you put me right out of the character, you know, and I couldn't help it. And the stage director who I'd gone to university with, she got really angry at me and she's like, be professional, stop laughing, you know, and you got to go back on stage. And I was terrified to go back on stage. And I remember calling up my agent and I said, please, I beg you, do anything, whatever you want to pay them, get me out of the show. I can't go back on stage. I was terrified to go back on. And it did kind of blow my performance, I got to say. Like, I couldn't get my mind off of that. And it just turned into this awful thing where each time I'd come back on stage with her, even though she didn't have that silly thing on anymore, it just did something that kind of took me out of character. I faked, you know, I feel like I faked the rest of the show. It was awful.
It stuck with you all this time as well. Can't forget it. One of your early roles was working on 21 Jump Street with Johnny Depp, but you also performed alongside Michael Ensign, I believe, who has one of the most impressive acting CVs I've seen, working on pretty much every American TV show, and a great role in Ghostbusters. And I met him at a Comic-Con a few years ago. He seems like a wonderful person.
He is. And the whole cast on that show were, you know, at the point that I was on it, I can't even remember what season, but it was certainly later on, like the 4th or 5th season. So they'd been together for quite a while. There was such wonderful chemistry, and it was like a party on the set. Tricky for me, but for them, they had a lot of fun.
Is it tough coming into something like that when everybody is so familiar with working together and all of a sudden you're this new kid in town?
It is, you know, because a cast gets so established, you know, and there's shorthand in how they communicate with each other and a lot of in-jokes and stuff. I mean, they were warm and welcoming, but if I was a much more seasoned actor on TV at that time, I wouldn't have been as nervous. But you know, Johnny Depp, I didn't really realize, I didn't see him as anything more than the rest of the cast. Almost everything I've done, it's only afterwards that you go, holy smokes, oh, that's who that was? You know, I knew that they were all successful and that they have a TV series. Anyone who has a TV series is very lucky. It means they're getting their rent paid consistently. So that's kind of nice. But yeah, you do feel a little bit an outsider. But the other guest stars, because it's usually more than one person that's in each episode, you know, we kind of clung together and hung out as these 2 other guys who've both done a lot of work on their own as well. Altogether, we had a lot of fun. It was definitely fun. But Johnny Depp is total prankster, pranking all the time.
You say it's not until after you've been on something that you reflect back on somebody you've worked with, but how was it working on Stakeout when you'd seen Richard Dreyfuss in Jaws? Was that a different thing?
Yeah, totally knew who he was. I mean, I also totally knew who Emilio Estevez was, you know, because the Breakfast Club was already out. And Richard Dreyfuss, in fact, I didn't really realize because my scenes weren't with him. You know, they were with Emilio. However, Richard Dreyfuss was there even for his off-screen lines for this bedroom scene where I'm in bed with Emilio. And at one point said threesome, and he comes running in and jumped into bed with me and Emilio. He was just so funny. So we did get to know each other. And in fact, he was so cordial and friendly and warm. I had a company called ProTrack, Professional Training for Actors, that myself and another actor would do. And we'd get different guest stars to come and talk to local actors. And so I asked him if he would be willing, Richard Dreyfuss. And he was like, oh, of course, of course. So he came, you know, and refused any money and told us all about his career. And he was just such a marvelous guy. But I was so struck that before he came to talk to the actors, I wanted to research, you know, because I would be just like you do as an interviewer. You want to make sure you know this person's work. And so I was at the grocery store. It was out at the window, right by the window of the grocery stores where they had VHS tapes, you know, back in the day. And so I was there with my boyfriend and we're looking through trying to get all the Richard Dreyfuss films. And I had seen somebody walk kind of by and sort of stop. I could see it out of the corner of my eye, but I hadn't really paid attention. And then suddenly somebody grabs me from behind, covers my eyes, and then he's like, guess who? And I couldn't figure it out, and I pull out, and it was Richard Dreyfuss. You know, my jaw dropped because A, I mean, here I am looking for his films, and B, he just saw and recognized that it was me. Like, I don't know, you know, somehow you always think that if it's a big star, you recognize them, but they won't recognize you. But he, you know, the fact that he remembered just from set. And so he goes, what are you doing? And I said, oh, I'm looking for films. And he goes, what films? I go, your films. And he goes, oh, of course, those are the best kind. You know? He was really funny. And I asked him, you know, do you go back and watch your films? And he goes, oh, every once in a while. He goes, I just fast forward. I go, bullshit, bullshit, me. Bullshit, bullshit, me.
You played Emilio's wife, and didn't he let you wear the engagement ring he brought for Demi Moore?
God for Demi Moore. It was this beautiful ring. You know, he was still, I think, really hurting at the time because they had been an item. They were engaged to get married, and she left him for Bruce Willis. And I guess when you think about it, you think of any role that Emilio's been in, he really hasn't had a wife or a girlfriend even, I don't think. I think that was the only time, you know. So anyway, he said, you know, I want to make use of this, so you wear it. So I wore it on set. And I remember when we were wrapping, he hadn't asked for it back. And I realized I still had it. For a moment, I thought about not saying anything. Then I thought better of it, and I told him. So he took it back. But no, we've remained friends. I mean, we've kind of drifted apart. I haven't spoken. Well, I did speak to him last year. But when I was living in LA, we saw each other quite often. He'd invite me to sets when he was filming and stuff, and we'd go out for a bite to eat. But since I've been up in Canada, you know, we haven't kept in touch much. And I just found him on Instagram, and I friended him, and he hasn't friended me back. So I don't know if he's seen it or what's going on. Emilio.
Get on it, Emilio. Get on it. How was your experience on the film Shoot to Kill? We know it as Deadly Pursuit over here, but that starred the legendary and sadly recently late Sidney Poitier.
Yeah, and that I was very aware of Sidney Poitier. This was just, there are no small roles, only small actors. No, but it was a small role. You know, it was a day player. Myself and this other actor, Blue Mankuma, who's done a lot of work in Vancouver, great actor. He and myself and one other woman were hired to play undercover cops. You know, we had a few lines initially. It ended up on the cutting room floor. But oddly enough, I was dressed as a nun working with Tom Berenger and Sidney when they were trying to capture the bad guy. And so I did have an opportunity to meet Sidney Poitier and talk with him. And he was really elegant and wonderful man, and I was very honored.
How did you find the move to Los Angeles and Hollywood in the late 80s? Did you have any idea of what to expect from the town, and how did the place and the industry itself compare to what you were familiar with in Canada?
Oh, so very different. And, you know, honestly, career-wise, it was probably one of the worst moves, although I can't really say that because otherwise I wouldn't have done Nightmare on Elm Street, which is why we're talking today. But at the time in Vancouver, I really was the up-and-coming, you know, I had my 2 seconds of fame as the it girl because I'd starred in these 2 films, Quarantine and Matinee.
When were they shot then, Beatrice? Because they're both listed as like 89 on IMDb. Was they shot prior to that?
Basically, I did Quarantine and then right back-to-back Matinee. And then I filmed Elm Street before those 2 came out because they came out at the Vancouver Film Festival. They both premiered. And I remember the director of Quarantine introduced me as, you know, oh, that Elm Street lady or something like that because we had a falling out by that point. Yeah, so Elm Street it was all around 89. Like that was sort of this big year. But in 1989, because I had starred in 2 films back to back and they both were opening at the same time, you know, I was sort of like on all the magazines. I think my career could have really skyrocketed there. Like I was in the position at the time to pretty much get any role if I wanted it, you know, which was really a wonderful place to be in. I mean, it took 10 years, but then I left it all just because I was following a boyfriend. He was also an actor, and every time I'd get a big starring role, he would end up leaving me or cheating on me. It was just bad codependent thing. But he left and moved to LA, and I ended up leaving everything behind and following him. Bad move. Anyone listening, never stop your career for a man or a woman. Dumb thing to do. They're a cheating, nasty guy.
How was it landing in Hollywood, though? Was you pretty much starting again, or did you have some connection? Because I think you signed to, was it Martin and Charlie Sheen's agency? Was that through the connection with Emilio?
Very well researched. Yeah, my connection with Emilio got me in to see her, the agent. And she really was like this boutique agent / manager. And she just had Martin Sheen, Charlie Sheen, and the sister, Renee Estevez. And she took me on, I guess, because I invited her to the screening of Quarantine in LA, and she was the one that got me the audition for Nightmare on Elm Street. But after doing Nightmare on Elm Street, the only films that I got offered was all horror films, which for all my horror fans, I know it's really dumb of me. I should have taken them all. But being from theater school and all that, you have this idea that you're this artist, and I don't know.
Any horror films you can remember the names of, which people might know of?
I wish I knew the name. I don't even know. But I just remember it was like riding on motorcycles, barely dressed. Something to do with, you know, and then getting raped by Satan or something. I don't know.
You might have made the right decision then, because like the early 90s weren't the best time for horror films.
I love scary movies, you know, and if it's got a good story, I would absolutely do it. And I'd love to play a scary person. And that's just, I think, would be very interesting. If they didn't all involve so much nudity, it probably would have been okay, you know, but the scripts I got offered all had nudity. And it was at the one point in my age that I probably could have carried it off. But I just felt like I just couldn't be doing that. And more than anything, it was really the stupid relationship that got me down there. It just wasn't working out. So I was going through a lot of struggle with that and trying to detach from that relationship. I was doing some work for David Kelly, the producer. He produces everything. He's married to Michelle Pfeiffer. We were actually living in David Kelly's house when I first got there. But when I left the industry was, as I said, to get away from this guy. So I kind of left my career in Vancouver to be with him, and then I left my career in LA to get away from him. So what the heck?
The role of Amanda Kruger from A Nightmare on Elm Street 5 comes around, which in the grand scheme of A Nightmare on Elm Street, that's a pretty iconic role. How familiar was you with the whole franchise up until that point?
So at the time, I definitely knew Nightmare on Elm Street. I'd seen it in high school, and I clearly knew who Freddy Krueger was. But that was about it. Like, I'd only seen the first one. I'd never seen 2, 3, 4. I didn't even know at the time that there had been an Amanda Kruger before. I truly didn't know. And because it was so fast, I was hired on the spot, and I didn't really have time to research. Everything was just a whirlwind. So no, I wasn't all that familiar with the background of Freddy Krueger. And to be honest with you, the director and the producer at the time, they were all trying to figure it out as we were going. Like, what is the story with Amanda? Is she dead? Is she alive? Is she a ghost? What the heck? So it was all kind of spur of the moment, everyone discovering and exploring together.
It's pretty amazing that they could turn a film around on such a short time frame. Part 4 being such a hit in '88, it was pretty much straight into the next one to have it out in time for the following summer. I'm guessing they probably announced it was going to be out the following summer, so it's like, damn, we got to pull his fingers out.
Never seen such a quick turnaround. It was crazy to have it out. Like, as I said, it was already out by the time Quarantine and Matinee, had filmed, and we're still, in post-production. And this one, film, post-production, everything, boom, boom, out quicker than that.
How long after getting the role did they start shooting? Do you remember?
I think it was pretty quick. Certainly, I think within a month or less than that, like a few weeks, or it really was fast. And, at least, and for my role, in a nun's habit, so they didn't have to have all these fittings, and I wasn't wearing any makeup, so they didn't have to do they didn't do really anything. I just showed up on set and boom, boom, we were there, ready to go.
Very cool. And I find it a film I enjoyed much more on returning to it years later. I was a massive Elm Street fan. Part 4 was the first one I saw in the cinema and couldn't wait till the following summer to see it. But I loved it even more a few years later. I don't remember it being this cool, the way it looks, the original themes and storylines, plus great characters, which Elm Street always had compared to a lot of horror films up to that point. How was your experience on the film compared to what you'd done before? Was it totally different, what with the scale of the sets and the practical special effects?
I absolutely loved it. The sets to this day, I can still just close my eyes and remember not just what we saw on screen, but, what I saw in person. There was something about, because it was in this huge warehouse, there was just this massive scale to everything. And it really brought you in. I'd never been on a film set where it really felt, every other film set, the truth of that scene ends just like 1 inch on either side of the camera. Wherever the camera stops looking, there's already the equipment and ropes. And, so if you for even a second look to your right, too far to the right, you're out of character.
Someone's making a cup of coffee.
People are walking around doing whatever. All my 4 different locations. One is there's the birth scene, which was in this creepy hospital, gross little room. That was all. Maybe that one, there wasn't that much outside of what you saw, pretty much outside of that. But I was surrounded by these nuns and doctors and such. So I really was kept in the reality of that scene. And then we go into this church, and that was huge and massive and phenomenal. The lighting, all the pigeons they kept throwing at me, and the smoky effect. It was so cool. Find me in the tower where I turn into a skeleton. That scene, I guess I remember that one the least. Still, I just remember the mood was still very much there. So many things, so many films, especially with special effects, they add a lot of it after production. But this, you really felt it. It was really set that way. And then, of course, that crazy Escher staircase thing at the end was wow, that was a huge set. That's the one that really I found jaw-dropping. I walked onto set that day, and they really, of course, the steps weren't real all the way up, but they were real stairs to a degree. I walked down them, and it was huge, and you really could imagine that you were there, or you didn't have to imagine, you were there. It was spectacular.
Isn't it true you didn't tell anyone about your role as Amanda Kruger? It was just your grandmother who went to see the film.
I didn't tell anyone, and I'll be honest with you, to this day, I don't think anyone else in my family's ever seen it. My parents have certainly never seen it, my siblings. No, I don't think anyone's seen it. Isn't that awful? awful.
Never Sleep Again, the Nightmare on Elm Street documentary, which was released in 2010, was this your first real indication that there was still so much life and legacy to these films?
I hadn't a clue. I truly had no clue. I hadn't, after doing Elm Street. So Elm Street was my last gig as an actor. And then I left the industry, to get away from this boyfriend, to rediscover myself. So I ended up in Taiwan for a year. I went to India, really life-changing 2 years in India, working on a mobile hospital and living in an ashram, and then being sent by my guru. When I decided I was going to stay in India and become a monk, she was like, nope. She sent me with a one-way ticket to New York. So when I came to New York, I ended up, getting married and opening a yoga studio and doing all this stuff. And I'd really pretty much left it behind. I mean, you can't really leave acting behind. So I did local theater, but under a different name because they weren't equity shows, and I'm still equity. And I did some student films just for the fun of acting. But otherwise, I'd pretty much left it behind. And so when they found me for that Never Sleep Again, and I met with a couple of the other actors from the show, that's where Toy Newkirk from number 4 was the one that said, how come we never see you at any of these conventions? I hadn't a clue, this whole world. And she goes, no, we go and fans come and we sign autographs. And I'm like, fans? You sign autographs? Like what? This was a film we did 30 years ago. I had no clue how big it was. I truly did not know.
How have your feelings of the film changed since its release and seeing the longevity that it has today?
I've really done a 360 over the past few years. I mean, just getting to know the fans, doing these shows, and also on Facebook. I mean, really basically I would just say the past year. After doing Never Sleep Again, I did 2 or 3 reunions with the cast of 5. And then after that, pretty much nothing for another 10 years. And I kind of moved on. But now it seems like there's been another whole breath brought into it. And 5 seems to be, people are starting to appreciate it more than they did, in the same way that Mark Patton and 2, people are really embracing, intentionally or not, the gay aspect of it, is being really honored and celebrated. And Mark is just absolutely wonderful. My cast 5, we've become really close because, doing the shows together. Then there's always the link because of Danny and Lisa, we kind of get linked into 4, and then you meet other people. I mean, I remember meeting other actors from the different ones. And so I actually bought the full set, the Elm Street, all 8 of them. And I've been going through and watching them. And I've always appreciated, the one thing I have appreciated about Elm Street in particular, and where I tie it in, I guess, for my spiritual side, is the whole concept that it's through our fears that he gets us. That's life. Right? That really is true of life. Our fears are what hold us back. Learning to go past your fears is an extremely spiritual thing. There is definitely a tie there. And I do feel that everything happens for a reason.
Some genius Wes Craven storytelling.
Yeah, just what you said, the characters, they really do develop the characters in Elm Street. I love that about it. It's not just random killings. It's, actual characters. And, even the fact that Freddy kind of, he taps into your nightmares, your fears, and that's how he gets you. And there's something pretty kind of cool about that.
Definitely. And you're heading back into acting, I believe. The horror genre in particular, it seems to be really embracing female actors who have previously worked in the genre. Lisa Wilcox, obviously, and Caroline Williams, who've both been on this show, and also Barbara Crampton, who's legendary. They're all constantly working. So is horror something you might consider doing more of nowadays?
I would, as long as it has a story, as long as it develops characters, I'm totally into it. I absolutely loved Squid Game. I watched the first episode and I'm like, oh my gosh, everyone being killed and, so much killing. And I thought, this is awful. But the characters were so darn interesting. They pulled you in, and then I watched the whole series and I absolutely loved it because of that. However much killing there is, it becomes part of it. And yes, you do get a little accustomed to it, which maybe isn't that good.
And I also believe you're also working on a book tracing Amanda Kruger's backstory.
There is such a story to her, when you think about, she's quite the character. I appreciate her even more and more now. I remember at the time playing her, I was just really trying to get into, this woman. She was a nun. We don't know, from the film, you don't know why she's a nun, but something drew her to that. And there's always a story for anyone that becomes a nun. And then the fact that she's doing this volunteer work and then getting raped by 100 maniacs and what that was like for her. And then to have this child, then to have a child as a nun and then having to give him up for adoption and, the whole story. And then what was it like for her, watching from the sidelines, watching this happen to her son. So there was a lot of material already there and I'm fleshing it out, kind of looking forward to that.
Was the talk of it maybe becoming a graphic novel as well? That'd be quite cool.
I think that would be really cool. And there's so many amazing artists out there. Yeah. So already, I have ideas from numerous fans that I've, seen their artwork. There's just so much so much material there.
Yeah. And there's just so much creativity from everybody nowadays. Like you say, you can reach out to so many different people these days. There's just almost too much stuff.
The whole Facebook and Instagram, which I'm so brand new to, but it's just like this tunnel, and it can be very time zapping because you're looking for something, and then you catch this picture, and then you see this cute puppy, and then you see this little monkey, and oh my goodness! And my husband's like yelling at me. He goes, "Get off that thing!" You're like the kids. It just takes me down this whirlwind of cuteness and weirdness and strangeness. And through it, I've met amazing artists, people that have done videos of Elm Street spoofs, and just it's this whole thing out there. Nightmare on Elm Street, it's jaw-dropping to me when I think about how huge it really is. Freddy Krueger and or Nightmare on Elm Street get mentioned in movies and talk shows, and it's part of our, language now, right? It's kind of crazy.
Beatrice, thanks ever so much for talking to us, and thanks for just being so cool to the whole Elm Street fan base and seeing you really jumping back in and acknowledging it. I know it means a lot to a lot of people, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you at Hampshire Horror Con later this year. It'll be very cool.
You better make it out there.
It's a boy!
When it comes to terror, remember, Freddy knows best.
Thanks so much to Amanda Kruger herself, Beatrice Boepple, for chatting with me here on the Straight to Video podcast. Beatrice can be found at conventions all over the USA, incredibly active and interacting with fans on social media, but we look forward to welcoming her to the UK when she will be appearing at Hampshire Horror Con in November. Simply search Hampshire Horror Con on Facebook to keep all up to date on guest announcements and hopefully see you there. For over 150 more episodes of this podcast, be sure to listen, follow, and like wherever you listen to your shows, or find everything you need over at stvpod.com. I really appreciate everyone that keeps coming back, and I've got some great chats already lined up for the coming weeks, so please stay in touch, and until we chat again, take care and speak soon.